preparation for the panel discussion, please use the app, making sure you're logged on to the right session, and put some questions and thoughts in there. So one of the questions comes is, what's a resilient society? The premise that we use for that National Resilience Project came from Plan Jericho. Now, I'm sure you'll already remember what the Chief of the Air Force in 2015 said, because you hang off every chief's words. But what he actually said then is, what's the characteristics of fifth generation Air Force? He talked about two. It sounds awfully simple, but I think they're pretty important. Number one, a fifth generation Air Force would have vastly improved shared situational awareness, and two, a much more improved ability to operate as an integrated team. So take the technologies that we're seeing in things like the JSF and apply those with innovative thinking to improve it. That's what we put into our study of the project. So what we came up with is, using that premise, we asked everybody in each of those areas, what do you think the characteristics are, whether it's economics or health or care? The first one is, if we're going to be resilient as a society on any area, is shared awareness and purpose, which requires a comprehensive risk analysis and a recognition of assumptions. You can see some common themes here. That's vastly improved shared situational awareness. The second characteristic attribute was teamed. In our nation, we cannot achieve anything unless there's a willingness to act together for the common good. It's really difficult with this trust, collaboration, and competition balance. Now, there's a third thing we put in there, which wasn't in Plan Jericho because it's just a part of how defence thinks and works, is that a resilient society is prepared and able to mobilise, because we have to prepare for future disasters and crises and not wait to react. These sound simple. Remember, rule, try and keep things down to 3. Problem. This is not a 3-step process. These are behaviours and attitudes that are predicated on leadership at all levels. So you can't contract this out to the big 4 consulting companies. You're going to have to do it yourself. There's going to be a shock. There's a lot of interesting things, though, that come out from Ukrainian leadership. Have a think about, after the annexation of Crimea, what they have done in terms of their military thinking, the leadership that's happened there, the preparation for the inevitable, is something to be admired. So, are we a resilient society? A couple of things to think about here. There is no national security strategy. The last one we had was in 2013, and that was moved away. There is no current national resiliency strategy. So what's that shared purpose, common goal that we as a nation are heading towards? We're still doing things in pieces. There's a lot of argument happening in the public domain by a lot of people about these issues. What does this mean for you in the audience today? Whether you're on a project, whether you're on a squadron, whether you're a defence civilian, whether you're in DSTG, analyse the vulnerabilities, risks and assumptions of everything you're doing. The assumptions I made when I was Deputy Chief sort of make me cringe right now. I actually thought that the outside world and logistics chains and how things work was as organised and focused as what was in defence, despite defence occasionally having problems there. Well, it's not. It's a lot more chaotic. And this war in Ukraine has highlighted the risks of being energy dependent on a potential adversary, and the amazingly overly optimistic assumptions that if you go back even a year and listen to some of the political leaders, you know, a tank war in the eastern part of Europe is never going to happen. We'll be right. We are in the same problem. We've grown to over 90% import dependence for our fuels, from 7 down to 2 refineries in the last 10 years. Those last 2 refineries will close before the end of the decade. We'll be 100% import dependent of fuel, and we have a growing dependence on China for our refined fuels. Immediately prior to the pandemic, of all the refined jet fuel we imported, 25% came from China. Now, the Defence Minister and the government's identified China as a real concern for us for security. Why are we becoming energy dependent on the country for which we're now buying nuclear submarines to defend against? Oh, by the way, nuclear submarines, they won't work without diesel either, because the whole support system of our nation runs on that. Designed for resilience. Plan Jericho again, bottom-up innovation means top-down design. It wasn't a throwaway line, it was something very important, because it comes from intellect, it comes from leadership, it comes from people taking great technologies and applying them sensibly. And finally, please be brutally honest about the limitations of the capabilities you're working on and what's needed from industry and civil society and the broader system to operate. You can't mobilise defence or be resilient without a resilient and mobilised society. It's just never going to happen. But by not being as forthright about this, what I've found in a lot of dealings I do with politicians and media, community groups, they assume that 72 JSFs will all just go off at the same time and do everything, don't worry about fuel. They don't understand that despite the very high level capabilities we have, we're a small force. And the infrastructure that supports us is limited. So please, think about these issues of what you do. But you're not all just in the military, we're all citizens of our respective countries. We're living in a time of shared tragedy. That's the reality. We need to refocus our efforts to build societal consensus and trust. Some of the lunacy stuff that's been going around on social media about 5G is an example. Because we're going to have to prepare and act to adapt to the reality of our changing world. We need leadership from all levels of Australian society in our case, particularly from powerful leaders in community, business, government, defence and politics. I certainly notice in the public commentary we need more thought coming out of defence in public because defence is trusted, it understands a lot of these issues, and we need, and you need, to help society look at it. Bottom line, we have to prepare and mobilise our society. As was earlier said by Benny, unprecedented is no excuse to be unprepared. So with that, we'll now switch to the panel discussion, and please bring up the questions. Cool. Just to start off, difficult. Carl, you were talking about resilience and context. Any additional thoughts you want to bring up about what the implications are of changing contexts for the resilience of our nation?
Yeah, I think that there's the holy grail of resilience is that we hope to be resilient to everything. No matter what's thrown at us, we can be resilient. And the first point is the reality is that a lot of our resilience capabilities represent highly optimized tolerance. They work really, really well within defined limits. As soon as we exceed the threshold, then they fail suddenly and can fail catastrophically. And because of the audience, and this might appeal more to the green and the khaki than to the blue, but if we think back to ancient Greece in, 4th century BC, where we had hoplite warfare, there was a sudden innovation that came out of a small kingdom called Macedon, with Philip and his son Alexander the Great, and they invented the combined massive pike block with 24-foot pike sarissas to pin down the enemy and then to use cavalry on the flanks while the main body was pinned down. And the Greeks couldn't withstand that. Their hoplite warfare that was designed for big blocks with short spears suddenly came across a pike block where every person, every Greek, was suddenly faced with 8 or 10 spear tips. And so the Greeks lost. And then the Persians lost. And then the Egyptians lost. And then the Indians lost. And we had one of the great Western expansions, one of the great military kingdoms, empires established. And even after Alexander died and the context changed, there was still resilience. The generals used the same Macedonian tactics in Hellenistic kingdoms from Greece all the way down to Egypt, and that was fine, right until a group of little upstarts from a little city in Italy came along called the Romans, and they innovated. They stole short swords, the idea for short swords from the Spanish. They stole the idea for armor, chain mail, from the Celts. They stole the idea, instead of having big round shields, having smaller shields, gave them more maneuverability. They stole that from the other Latin tribes. The context suddenly changed, and the remnants, the successors to the Macedonian Empire, could not adapt. Their resilience collapsed suddenly over a space of a decade. And Rome then reigned supreme for the next 6-7 centuries until nomadic cavalry innovations outpaced their ability to innovate. The context changed again, and there was a sudden contraction to the Byzantine Empire. And that survived, that innovated, until the Arab expansions and the Arab invasions in the times of the very first Crusades. And then the Byzantine Empire collapsed. And we see empires innovate in a certain context only when that context changes dramatically, either militarily or because of climate change. And there are dozens of highly resilient civilizations that have collapsed because they could not adapt. They were highly specialized, but the new environment destroyed what resilience they had.
Some good lessons for Western civilization, isn't it? Tanya, look, given the shared challenges and what Secretary Austin has called the strategic imperative partnership, do we have the right balance between export control and innovation collaboration?
Look, that's an excellent question and is very front of mind as we really start to deepen our mutual reliance with allies and start to activate partnerships like AUKUS. I don't think we're there yet. I think where we need to get to is absolute clarity of areas where Australia has absolute niche advantage. What I've seen shift, even in the last 6 to 12 months, is a recognition, even from our deepest, strongest allies, that we have something to offer that helps them accelerate capability advantage, helps them deliver on a counter to a threat that they see accelerating. That is a huge opportunity for Australia. We need to make sure then that Australia really can double down on capitalising areas of niche advantage. I'll give one example that's in the public domain. Australia has a deep, long-term bilateral relationship with the United States in the area of hypersonics. And earlier this year, Minister Dutton launched our Eagle Farm Hypersonics Research Development Precinct up in Queensland. The US recognises that there are niche elements of Australian R&D and industrial capacity that will allow it to get after its aims in hypersonic vehicle development and hypersonic weapon programs faster than it would do alone. But what we need to make sure we do is that we have the right legislative and export and policy elements that mean that Australian industry can then serve allied requirements. That's the direction we're headed in. We can't do it across the board, but what we can do is find those pipe cleaners that allow us to flush the system out and change the way we work together. What's clear to me at the moment is leaders at the most senior levels get it and are talking differently about the way we work together. What now needs to flush through with that pipe cleaner is our ways of working, our procedures, our processes.
Thanks. Look, there's a question come up now about UAV swarms. Do we look to utilising them for defence of other swarms, against other swarms, especially on RAF bases with expensive exposed assets? I guess a point I'd raise here is, well, yep, absolutely, but don't just think about military bases. Have a think about our infrastructure across the north of Australia, particularly our gas infrastructure, LNG plants. And I have asked the question about how are they defended against things like UAVs, given what we saw happen in the Middle East with the drone strikes on the Saudi refinery. And I'll still never forget, I think there was a Saudi Air Force colonel standing there with the burning wreckage behind, basically saying how the whole air defence system was operating as designed. So we need to think about how we apply this to our civil infrastructure, because our defence at the moment in those areas is very, very limited. Tanya, any particular thoughts on where this goes?
Great comments there, John. I'd just simply add that I think we've always got to look for asymmetry. You need to have great capability in things like swarm technologies in order to understand how to counter swarms, but you don't always counter swarms with swarms. There are other asymmetric technologies, such as directed energy, that can allow you to work differently in countering swarms, but that doesn't get you away from having to have that deep understanding or expertise, either in nation or with allies, to understand how to get that asymmetry in countering.
It'll be fascinating to see how they mechanise directed energy around an LNG plant. Just a few risks. Carl, if you could rebuild the education system to help our citizens and society better deal with the complexity, what parts of the education system would you change?
Well, I'd certainly earn a lot of money as a consultant if I could do it from scratch. Look, I'm very critical, and it may be a reflection of the universities which I've worked in and which I've collaborated in. Now, we have some absolutely world-class academics and researchers. We have some absolutely world-class centres of excellence in Australian universities. But we also have a great number of areas where we have people occupying seats that are teaching the young people coming in, and they're teaching them based on their experiences of 20, 30 years ago. They're teaching them, as I said, quite often, irrespective of what technology they're using, but there's little difference in the way that the knowledge is imparted compared to how it was imparted 400 years ago by monks or priests teaching at Cambridge University or Oxford University or Heidelberg University. I'll use a story which is a true story based on a conversation I had quite a few years ago when we were trying to set up a centre of excellence for industry, teaching leadership in industry. And it was going to be mainly run by our Faculty of Law. And I could not understand why the Dean was so resistant to all of the recommendations that were being put forward. And he took me aside and said, quite simply, I do not have the staff that can stand up in front of senior leadership in government or industry and tell them a convincing narrative and get them to understand what we're doing. So our university system, and I see this in the UK, I've seen this in Australia, in New Zealand, I've seen it in Canada, I've seen it in the US. We have groups of academics that are great at teaching 18-year-old kids how to learn, how to remember stuff to reproduce in an exam. We don't necessarily have the right people to teach people how to think differently in a modern world. And we can't change the education system till we change the way we recruit and develop the very people that are responsible for teaching our kids. I'm seeing more innovation at the secondary school level in teaching and learning than I'm seeing in the higher education system.
That's a problem. Thanks, Carl, for that perspective. Well, lunchtime has arrived, so please join me in thanking the presenters today.